Welcome to kindness in real life. Imagine a woman who baked her way to love and triumph. But what if it all started with nothing? Here's a taste to hook you. The phone rang at 3 a.m., the clock's red numbers glaring like an omen. Lila answered, trembling, and a stranger's voice cut through. Mrs. Brooks? It's the hospital. Your husband's been in an accident. The doctor pulled back the sheet. Ethan's sandy hair matted with blood, his green eyes closed forever. Then came the debts, secrets he'd buried in lies. How could she rise from this? Want to know how Lila turned chaos into sweetness? Stick around. If this story stirs your soul, smash that like button and subscribe to Kindness in Real Life. The kitchen smelled of sugar and possibility, a warm haze of flour dust swirling in the late afternoon light. Lila Harper stood on a wobbly stool, her 7-year-old fingers clutching a wooden spoon almost as big as her arm. Her dark brown hair, tied back with a frayed ribbon, swung as she leaned over the counter, watching her mother's hands move like magic. The cake layers, golden and spongy, sat cooling on a wire rack, and beside them, a bowl of whipped cream gleamed, soft peaks rising like tiny mountains. "Careful now, Lila," her mother, Evelyn, said, her voice gentle but firm. She was a wiry woman in her 30s, with olive skin and tired hazel eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, which wasn't often these days. Her apron, stained with years of batter and jam, hung loosely over a faded blue dress. She dipped a spatula into the cream and handed it to Lila. "Spread it nice and even, like this." Lila nodded, her tongue poking out in concentration as she smeared the cream between the layers. It squished under the spatula, cool and smooth, and she giggled as a dollop plopped onto her wrist. She licked it off, the sweetness bursting on her tongue, vanilla, sugar, a hint of something dreamy she couldn't name. At that moment, the world clicked into place. This was it. This was what she wanted to do forever. Make cakes, fill rooms with that sugary warmth, see people smile as they took a bite. "Looks good, sweet pea," Evelyn said, brushing a strand of hair from Lila's forehead. She glanced at the clock above the sink, a chipped relic from better days, and her smile faded. "Your daddy'll be home soon. Better clean up." Lila's stomach tightened. Jack wasn't the same daddy he'd been when she was smaller, the one who'd lifted her onto his shoulders to pick apples from the neighbor's tree. Back then, he'd only sip beer on Saturdays, laughing too loud as he flipped burgers on their rusty grill. Now, at 38, his broad frame slumped, his ruddy face shadowed by stubble and a scowl. The drinking had crept from weekends to weeknights, then to every day, a bottle of cheap whiskey always within reach. He'd stumble in, reeking of alcohol, his voice a growl that made the walls feel smaller. The back door banged open, and Lila flinched. Jack staggered in, his work boots caked with mud, his flannel shirt untucked. His bloodshot brown eyes scanned the kitchen, landing on the cake. "What's this?" he slurred, grabbing a corner of the counter to steady himself. "Wasting time on sweets again." "It's for Mrs. Carter," Evelyn said quickly, stepping between him and Lila. "She's paying $10. We need it." Jack snorted, swiping a finger through the cream and popping it into his mouth. $10 won't fix nothing." He lurched toward the fridge, pulling out a beer despite the half-empty whiskey bottle on the table. "Where's my dinner?" Lila slid off the stool, her small hands trembling as she grabbed a rag to wipe the counter. She kept her head down, letting her hair shield her face. Evelyn moved fast, pulling a pot of leftover stew from the stove, her shoulders hunched like she was bracing for a storm. The stew simmered, but the air stayed cold. Jack slumped into a chair, muttering about his boss, his job at the lumber yard, how the world owed him something it never paid. Evelyn served him silently, her lips a thin line, while Lila hovered near the sink, the rag damp in her grip. She glanced at the cake, her cake, and felt a flicker of pride smothered by the weight of her father's glare. Later, after Jack passed out on the couch, his snores rattling the windows, Lila crept back to the kitchen. Evelyn sat at the table, her head in her hands, the cake boxed up for Mrs. Carter. The room was quiet now, save for the hum of the fridge and the distant chirp of crickets outside. Lila climbed onto a chair, resting her chin on her folded arms. Mama, she whispered, can we open a pastry shop someday? Just you and me. Evelyn lifted her head, her hazel eyes softening. A shop. She reached over, brushing Lila's cheek with flour-dusted fingers. That'd be something, wouldn't it? Walls lined with cakes, cookies, pies, everything sweet. And no yelling, Lila added, her voice small but fierce. Evelyn's smile wavered, but she nodded. No yelling. Just us and the sugar. She pulled Lila into a hug, her apron crinkling between them. Someday, sweet pea. We'll make it happen. But someday felt far away. The next morning, Lila woke to the clatter of bottles as Jack rummaged for his stash. He was late for work again, his curses echoing through the thin walls of their clapboard house. Evelyn packed the cake into a basket, her movements quick and mechanical, then hustled Lila out the door for school. By noon, word trickled back. Jack had been fired. He'd shown up drunk, tripped over a stack of planks, and cussed out the foreman. Lila overheard it from Mrs. Jenkins, the school cook, who whispered it to the janitor while Lila scrubbed trays in the cafeteria. Her chest tightened, a knot of shame and fear she couldn't untangle. When she got home, Jack was sprawled across the couch, a bottle dangling from his hand. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, her face pale, kneading dough with a fury that made her knuckles white. He's done it this time, she muttered, slamming the dough onto the counter. No job, no money, just us now. Lila dropped her backpack by the door, the straps frayed from years of use. What about the shop, Mama? Evelyn paused, her hands still in the dough. She looked at Lila, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'll keep making cakes. We'll get by. But a shop. She shook her head, wiping her hands on her apron. That's a dream for later, sweet pea. That night, Evelyn took a job as a night clerk at the school, leaving Lila with a plate of cornbread and a promise to be back by dawn. She'd come home exhausted, her fingers stained with ink from ledgers, and head straight to the kitchen to bake. Cakes for neighbors, cookies for church sales, anything to keep the lights on. Lila watched her mother shrink, her olive skin growing sallow, her dreams buried under flour and fatigue. Jack didn't help. He drank more, pawned the TV, then the radio, his temper flaring at every bill that piled up on the table. Lila learned to tiptoe around him, her small frame shrinking into corners, her hazel eyes, mirror images of her mother's, tracking his every move. But in the quiet moments, when it was just her and Evelyn, they'd bake together. A lemon tart, a batch of scones, the kitchen a sanctuary of sugar and silence. One evening, as they piped icing on a cupcakes, Lila traced a swirl and said, I'm going to be a pastry chef, Mama. Like you, but bigger. I'll make cakes so good, people line up around the block. Evelyn laughed, a rare, bright sound that lit up the room. You will, Lila. You've got the hands for it, and the heart. She kissed the top of Lila's head, her lips warm against her hair. Just hold on to that dream, okay? No matter what. Lila nodded, her small fingers curling around the piping bag. She didn't know then how heavy that promise would become, how the years would stretch and twist it, pulling her further from the kitchen she loved. But in that moment, with the cream still sweet on her tongue and her mother's arms around her, she believed it was possible. Outside, Jack's snores rumbled, a storm brewing on the horizon. Lila ignored it, focusing on the cupcake in her hand, the swirl of icing a tiny rebellion against the chaos waiting to swallow them whole. The years rolled by like dough under Evelyn's rolling pin, slow, heavy, and relentless. Lila Harper turned 18 under a gray November sky, the air sharp with the bite of frost and the faint tang of whiskey that clung to their house like a ghost. The kitchen, once her sanctuary, had become a battleground of necessity. Flour sacks slumped against the wall, their contents dwindling with every cake Evelyn baked to keep the roof over their heads. The chipped clock still ticked above the sink, its hands a cruel reminder of time slipping away from the dreams they'd whispered about a decade ago. Lila stood at the counter, her slim frame taller now, her dark brown hair pulled into a tight ponytail that brushed her shoulders. Her hazel eyes, sharp and restless, followed her mother's hands as they kneaded dough for a batch of cinnamon rolls. Evelyn's olive skin had dulled, her cheeks hollow from years of double shifts. Days at the school clerk's desk, nights elbow-deep in batter. Her faded apron hung like a shroud, and her movements, though practiced, carried the weight of exhaustion. "Mrs. Delaney wants these by noon," Evelyn said, her voice hoarse from a cold she couldn't shake. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of flour. $10. Maybe we can fix the heater this time." Lila nodded, cracking eggs into a bowl with a flick of her wrist. She'd grown deft in the kitchen, her hands steady from years of helping. Whipping cream, piping icing, rolling dough until her arms ached. She could bake a perfect sponge cake blindfolded, her fingers knowing the rhythm of sugar and butter like a song. But it wasn't enough. The money trickled in, swallowed by bills and Jack's endless bottles. Jack Harper hadn't changed, only worsened. His broad shoulders hunched now, his ruddy face bloated from years of liquor. Fired from the lumber yard, he'd taken odd jobs, hauling scrap, digging ditches, only to drink away every dime. The couch was his kingdom, a sagging throne of stained cushions where he sprawled, muttering curses at a world he blamed for his ruin. Lila avoided him, her steps light as a cat's, but his presence loomed, a storm cloud ready to burst. "I could sell cakes too, Mama," Lila said, her voice cutting through the hum of the oven. She dusted flour from her jeans, patched at the knees from hand-me-downs. "We'd make more. Enough for shop, maybe." Evelyn froze, her hands still in the dough. She turned, her hazel eyes, mirror images of Lila's, clouded with something between fear and resolve. "No, Lila, you're not tying yourself to this sink like me. You're getting an education. A real job." "But I don't want a real job," Lila shot back, her tone sharp. "I want to bake. Like you. Like we always said. That was a dream, sweet pea." Evelyn's voice cracked, her fingers gripping the counter. "Look around. Cakes won't pay for a life. Not with him." She jerked her head toward the living room, where Jack's snores rumbled. "You need something steady. Accounting. You'll always find work with numbers." Lila's jaw tightened, her hands balling into fists. She hated numbers, cold, lifeless things that mocked her with their order. But she saw the desperation in her mother's face, the plea beneath the exhaustion. Arguing felt like kicking a wounded bird. "Fine," she muttered, turning back to the eggs. "College it is." The next fall, Lila enrolled at the local community college, her tuition scraped together from Evelyn's savings and a pittance of financial aid. She studied accounting in a gray classroom, the fluorescent lights buzzing like flies overhead. Her classmates scribbled notes, their faces blank, while Lila doodled cakes in the margins, swirls of frosting, tears of sponge, anything to escape the droning lectures. She hated it, every minute of it, but she stayed for Evelyn. Then Jack died. It was a Tuesday, the air thick with rain. He'd stumbled home from a bar, collapsed in the yard, and didn't wake up. Alcohol poisoning, the coroner said, his liver a shriveled wreck. Lila stood by the shallow grave, her coat soaked, watching dirt pile over the cheap pine box. Evelyn wept silently beside her, her thin frame trembling, but Lila felt nothing, just a hollow quiet where his chaos had been. The funeral drained their savings, every penny swallowed by the undertaker's bill. Evelyn worked harder, her cough worsening, her hands shaking as she piped roses onto cakes late into the night. Lila took a part-time job at a diner, flipping burgers and scrubbing grease, her apron smelling of fries instead of sugar. They survived, but barely, the house creaking under the weight of their grief and debt. In her third year of college, Lila's world tilted again. She sat in the cafeteria, her accounting textbook open but ignored, when a shadow fell across the table. She looked up, and there he was, Ethan Brooks, tall and lean, with sandy hair that flopped over his forehead and warm green eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He was 21, a transfer student from a city 2 hours away, his faded jacket slung over one shoulder. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice easy, like he'd known her forever. Lila shrugged, pushing her tray aside. It's a free country. He dropped into the chair, setting down a coffee cup that steamed in the chilly air. You look like you'd rather be anywhere but here, he said, nodding at her textbook. Accounting, huh? She snorted, flipping the book shut. Yeah, my mom's idea. Thinks it's my ticket out. Out of what? Lila hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. This, she said finally, gesturing vaguely at the dingy cafeteria, the life she couldn't name. She wants me safe, stable. Ethan leaned back, studying her with a quiet intensity. And what do you want? The question hit her like a punch. No one had asked that since she was 7, smearing cream with Evelyn. To bake, she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Pastry chef. Cakes, tarts, everything. It's stupid, I know. It's not stupid, he cut in, his grin widening. It's cool. My aunt owns a bakery. I grew up sneaking cookies from her counter. Lila blinked, caught off guard by his enthusiasm. Yeah, well, my mom says it's not enough. Can't live on dough and dreams. Maybe not, Ethan said, sipping his coffee. But you're in your 3rd year. Get the degree, make her happy, then do what you want. Life's long. She laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the linoleum. You sound like you've got it all figured out. Not even close. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. But I'm good at faking it. Coffee sometime? You could tell me more about those cakes. Lila's cheeks warmed, but she smirked. Only if you're buying. Deal. He stood, slinging his jacket over his shoulder. See you around, Lila Harper. She watched him go, his stride easy through the crowd, and felt something shift, a spark, faint but real, cutting through the gray. That night, she dreamed of cakes again, towering tiers of frosting. But this time, Ethan was there, handing her a piping bag with that crooked grin. Back home, Evelyn coughed into her sleeve, her hands trembling as she boxed up a batch of cookies. Lila watched from the doorway, her textbooks heavy in her bag. You okay, Mama? She asked, stepping closer. Just tired, Evelyn lied, her voice thin. You studying hard? Yeah, Lila said, swallowing the truth. She didn't tell her about Ethan, about the coffee date, about the ache in her chest that grew every time she opened that damn textbook. She couldn't. Not when Evelyn's eyes held that fragile hope, the belief that numbers would save them. But as she climbed into bed, the house creaking around her, Lila whispered to the dark, I'm keeping my promise, Mama. Just not your way. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the faint scent of sugar from the kitchen below, a promise of its own, waiting to be claimed. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and grease, a sharp contrast to the sugar-dusted memories Lila Harper carried in her bones. She stood behind the counter, her apron tied tight around her slim waist, wiping down the chipped formica with a rag that had seen better days. Her dark brown ponytail swung as she moved, her hazel eyes flicking to the clock above the door. 5 minutes until her shift ended, 5 minutes until she could escape the hum of the fryer and the drone of trucker chatter. It was a Friday in late spring, the air outside thick with the promise of rain. Lila was 21 now, her 3rd year of college dragging on like a stubborn dough that refused to rise. She'd been meeting Ethan Brooks for coffee every few weeks since that day in the cafeteria, his warm green eyes and easy grin a lifeline in the gray sea of balance sheets and ledgers. He'd sit across from her at the corner booth, sipping black coffee while she rambled about butter ratios and sponge textures, her hands sketching invisible cakes in the air. You're wasted on numbers, he'd said last time, leaning back with that crooked smile. You light up when you talk about baking. It's like watching a fire catch. She'd blushed, hiding behind her mug. Yeah, well, fire doesn't pay the bills. Not yet. But Ethan had a way of making her believe it could. He was steady where she was restless, his sandy hair always a little messy, his faded jackets smelling faintly of pine and ambition. He loved economics, dreamed of university, of building something big, unlike Lila, who felt trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. Still, with him, the weight of Evelyn's expectations felt lighter, the promise she'd made at 7 a little less impossible. The bell above the diner door jingled, snapping her back to the present. Ethan strode in, his jacket speckled with raindrops, his grin brighter than the flickering neon sign outside. "Hey, pastry chef," he called, sliding onto a stool. "Got time for a broke student?" Lila smirked, tossing the rag aside. "Only if he tips." She poured him a coffee, black as tar, and leaned on the counter. "What's up? Got you something?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled flyer. He smoothed it on the counter. "A baking contest at the county fair. First prize $500. Saw it downtown. Thought of you." Her breath caught as she scanned the paper. "Show off your sweetest skills." The words igniting a flicker of heat in her chest. $500, she murmured, her fingers tracing the date. "I could win it," Ethan finished, his eyes locked on hers. "You'd wipe the floor with them, Lila. I've seen you with a whisk. It's magic." She laughed, but the sound was shaky. "Mom'd kill me. She'd say it's a waste of time." "She'd be wrong," he said softly, his hand brushing hers as he slid the flyer closer. "This is you. Take a shot." Lila tucked the flyer into her apron, her heart thudding. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. That night, she dreamed of cakes, towering, sugared masterpieces, Ethan cheering as she took the prize. But dreams didn't last. 2 weeks later, Evelyn collapsed. It was a Sunday, the kitchen thick with the scent of caramel as she stirred a pot for a neighbor's order. Lila was at the table, her textbook open, when she heard the clatter, a spoon hitting the floor, then Evelyn's body crumpling beside it. "Mama!" Lila lunged, dropping to her knees. Evelyn's olive skin was clammy, her hazel eyes half open, her breath a ragged wheeze. "Hold on, please." The ambulance came too late. At the hospital, a doctor with tired eyes and a clipboard told Lila the truth. Heart failure, years in the making, hidden behind Evelyn's coughs and trembling hands. She'd never sought treatment, never had the time or money. Lila sat in the sterile waiting room, her sneakers scuffing the linoleum, her mind replaying every moment she'd missed the signs, every late night, every forced smile. Evelyn was gone by dawn. Lila buried her in a plot beside Jack, the rain soaking her black dress as she tossed a handful of dirt onto the coffin. The savings were gone again, eaten by another funeral, leaving Lila alone in the clapboard house with nothing but silence and a whisk on the counter, a relic of their first cake together. She didn't cry, not then. She moved through the days like a ghost, sleeping on the couch where Jack had once sprawled, the diner her only tether. Ethan found her there a week later, her apron stained with ketchup, her eyes hollow. "Lila," he said, his voice breaking through the fog. He pulled her outside, the rain a soft patter on the awning. "You can't keep doing this. You're fading." "She's gone," Lila whispered, her hands twisting the apron. "Everything's gone." "Not everything." He cupped her face, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "You've got me. In that dream, she'd want you to chase it." She shook her head, pulling away. "I can't. I've got college bills." "Screw college," he said, fiercer than she'd ever heard him. "You hate it. I'll help you. We'll figure it out." That night, Lila sat in Evelyn's kitchen, the whisk in her lap. She traced its worn handle, remembering the cream between the layers, her mother's laugh. Ethan was right. Evelyn had wanted her safe, but she'd wanted her happy too. The flyer sat on the table, its edges curling. Lila grabbed it, her resolve hardening like sugar in a hot pan. The fair was a blur of color and noise, booths draped in red and white, the air thick with fried dough and cotton candy. Lila stood at her station, her hands steady as she piped buttercream onto a 3-tiered lemon cake, its zest sharp against the sweetness. Ethan hovered nearby, his green eyes bright with pride, sneaking her a thumbs up between bites of a stolen cupcake. The judges, a plump woman with a clipboard and an old man with a chef's hat, circled her table. The woman took a bite, her eyebrows shooting up. "Remarkable," she murmured, scribbling notes. The man nodded, his mustache twitching. "Best I've tasted in years." When they called her name, Lila Harper, first place. The crowd cheered, Ethan's whoop loudest of all. She clutched the $500 check, her hands trembling, tears blurring the ink. She'd done it. For Evelyn. For herself. Ethan pulled her into a hug, his jacket damp from the drizzle. "Told you," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "You're unstoppable." Back home, Lila packed up the house. She couldn't stay. The memories were too heavy, the walls too thin. She moved into Evelyn's apartment downtown, a cramped space with peeling wallpaper and a single window overlooking a brick alley. Ethan helped, carrying boxes up the narrow stairs, his laughter filling the emptiness. The kitchen was tiny, but it was hers. She set the whisk on the counter, its metal glinting under the bare bulb, and unpacked a photo. Her and Evelyn, flour on their cheeks, smiling over a lopsided cake. "I'm doing it, Mama," she whispered, her voice thick. "Watch me." Ethan appeared behind her, his arms slipping around her waist. "What's next, Chef?" he asked, resting his chin on her shoulder. "More cakes," she said, leaning into him. "And you'd better marry me soon, because I'm not doing this alone." He laughed, spinning her to face him. "First date, and you're proposing? You're full of surprises." "Get used to it," she shot back, her grin matching his. They kissed, slow and sweet, the taste of victory lingering between them. Outside, the rain tapped the window, a soft rhythm to their new beginning. Lila didn't know what lay ahead. Ethan's dreams, her own. But for the first time, the weight of her promise felt like wings instead of chains. The apartment smelled of cinnamon and hope, a faint sweetness cutting through the musty air of peeling paint and old wood. Lila Harper, now Lila Brooks, stood at the tiny kitchen counter, her slim fingers rolling dough into perfect crescents. Her dark brown hair was loose, curling at the ends from the steam of a simmering pot, and her hazel eyes glinted with quiet determination. At 24, she wore a faded apron over a simple green dress, the $500 from the baking contest long spent on rent and a second-hand oven that hummed like a loyal friend. Ethan Brooks leaned against the doorway, his sandy hair tousled, his green eyes tracing her every move. He was 25 now, a university student with a part-time job at a logistics firm, his faded jacket slung over a chair. They'd married a month after her college graduation, a small ceremony in the courthouse with a grocery store cake she'd baked herself, vanilla with a messy swirl of frosting. He'd promised her a life where she could bake to her heart's content, and she'd promised him her heart. "Smells like heaven in here," he said, stepping closer to swipe a crescent roll from the tray. She swatted his hand, but he popped it into his mouth anyway, grinning. "You're gonna make me fat, Chef." "You'd look good fat," she teased, dusting flour from her hands. "Besides, I need a taste tester. Sophie's gonna need the best cookies." Sophie Brooks, their daughter, was a year old, asleep in a crib wedged between the couch and the wall. Her tiny face, a blend of Lila's sharp features and Ethan's soft curls, peeked out from a blanket Lila had sewn from old shirts. The apartment was cramped, barely room for a table, let alone a nursery, but was theirs a fragile bubble of warmth against the world outside. Ethan's job kept them afloat, his promotion to junior manager bringing just enough to cover rent and diapers. Lila still worked as an accountant part-time, her diploma a grudging lifeline, but every spare moment was spent baking, cakes for neighbors, cookies for church fairs, her hands reclaiming the dream she'd fought for. Ethan's faith in her never wavered. He'd come home with flyers for baking classes, scraps of paper with scribbled recipes he'd overheard at work. "We'll get there," he'd say, kissing her forehead. "You'll have that shop yet." But there kept slipping further away. One evening, Ethan came home with a strange glint in his eyes, his jacket slung over his shoulder like a shield. "Lila," he said, setting a stack of papers on the table, "I've been thinking about a car." She paused, a piping bag hovering over a tray of cupcakes. "A car? We can barely afford groceries." "It's for us," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "For Sophie. I'm up for another promotion, bigger clients, bigger meetings. I can't keep showing up on a bus. We've got savings, and a loan will cover the rest." Lila's stomach twisted. She saw the numbers in her head. Rent, utilities, the endless tally of their life. Alone against what? He hesitated, his green eyes flickering. "The apartment. It's all we've got." "No," she said, dropping the piping bag. "Ethan, if something goes wrong, if you lose the job, we're out on the street." Nothing's going wrong, he insisted, stepping closer. He took her hands, his thumbs brushing her knuckles. I've never let you down, have I? Trust me, Lila. This is for us. She resisted, her accountant's mind screaming warnings, but his certainty wore her down. He'd always kept his promises. The degree, the wedding, the dream he'd nurtured when she'd lost Evelyn. A month later, they drove home in a sleek silver car, Sophie giggling in the back seat, Ethan's hand warm on hers. For a moment, it felt like victory. Then the nausea hit. 2 weeks after the car, Lila woke dizzy, her stomach churning. She stumbled to the bathroom, clutching the sink as the room spun. Ethan found her there, his face paling. You okay? I think, she swallowed, meeting his eyes. I think I'm pregnant again. His grin split wide, worry forgotten. Another one? Lila, that's... He pulled her into a hug, laughing into her hair. We'll manage. I'll make it work. But managing grew harder. Morning sickness stole her appetite, her baking slowing to a crawl. Ethan worked longer hours, his shoulders slumping under the weight of loans he didn't mention. More than just the car, she'd later learn. The company faltered, layoffs whispered in the halls, but he brushed it off, his smile strained. It's fine, he'd say, kissing her forehead. I've got this. Until he didn't. It was a frigid January night, Sophie 3.5. The baby never born, lost to a miscarriage that left Lila hollow. She sat on the couch, Sophie asleep in her lap, when the phone rang. The clock read 3 a.m., its red numbers a glaring omen. She answered, her voice trembling, and a stranger's voice cut through. Mrs. Brooks? It's the hospital. Your husband's been in an accident. The world tilted. She left Sophie with Clara Evans, the neighbor who barely knew her, and raced to the hospital in a cab, the city a blur of lights and ice. The doctor met her in a sterile hall, his face grim. He hit a train track. Couldn't stop in time. I'm sorry, he didn't make it. Lila followed him to the morgue, her sneakers squeaking on the tile. The sheet pulled back, and there was Ethan, his sandy hair matted with blood, his green eyes closed forever. She screamed, a raw sound that echoed off the walls, her knees buckling as the doctor caught her. The days blurred into weeks. Investigators pieced it together. Ethan, overworked and exhausted, had missed a barrier, the train smashing the car to wreckage. His last words, they said, were a whispered, I'm sorry. Lila buried him beside Evelyn, Sophie clutching her hand, too young to understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. Then the debts surfaced. Ethan had lied. Multiple loans, not just one, taken against the apartment and more. The company had gone bankrupt months ago, his paycheck a trickle he'd hidden with 4 smiles. Bailiffs came, their boots heavy on the stairs, papers demanding payment she couldn't give. Pay or leave, they said, handing her a sum that made her vision swim. She begged Clara for a night's shelter, kneeling in the hall, but Clara's cold no shut the door. With Sophie's hand in hers and a black bag of scraps, cookies, milk, bread, tossed from Clara's window, Lila stepped into the night. The train station was their refuge, its benches hard under their coats, Sophie's small voice asking, Mommy, are we going somewhere? No, baby, Lila whispered, brushing curls from her daughter's face. Just staying here for now. But even that didn't last. A guard rousted them the next night, his flashlight harsh in their eyes. This ain't a hotel, he snapped. Move it. Out on the street, the wind bit at their skin, Sophie's tiny frame shivering against her. Lila's anger flared, at Ethan for his lies, at herself for not seeing, at a world that chewed them up and spat them out. Her dream of cakes felt like ash, the whisk in her bag a cruel joke. They wandered to a park, Sophie playing on a slide as Lila sank onto a bench, her hands empty. Then a scream. Sophie's voice jerked her upright. Mommy, look, the stroller. A runaway stroller rolled toward the road, a blue-eyed boy inside, oblivious. Lila sprinted, her heart pounding, and grabbed it just as a car screeched past, inches from disaster. A man ran up, his expensive coat flapping. Miles Carter, tall and broad, his dark eyes wide with relief. You saved my son, he gasped, hugging her. Anything. Ask me anything. Lila froze, Sophie tugging her hand. We're fine, she lied, her voice shaking. But Miles looked at her, really looked, and saw the weight she carried. Tell me, he said, softer now. What do you need? And in that moment, with the wind howling and Sophie's warmth against her, Lila's crumbled world cracked open, just enough for a sliver of light to slip through. The abandoned restaurant smelled of dust and despair, a cavern of cracked plaster and overturned chairs cloaked in shadows. Lila Brooks stood in the doorway, her slim frame dwarfed by the emptiness, her dark brown hair tangled from the wind outside. Her hazel eyes, weary but sharp, scanned the grime-streaked windows and the chipped counter where cobwebs clung like forgotten lace. In her hand, she gripped a set of keys Miles Carter had pressed in her palm, his voice still echoing. It's yours now. Do what you want with it. Sophie Brooks, 3.5, clung to her leg, her sandy curls bouncing as she peeked inside. Mommy, is this our house? She asked, her green eyes, Ethan's eyes, wide with curiosity. No, baby, Lila said, crouching to brush a curl from her daughter's face. It's better. It's our chance. Miles Carter lingered behind them, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the door. At 35, he cut an imposing figure, tall, with fair skin and dark hair swept back, his deep brown eyes softened by gratitude. His tailored coat and polished shoes screamed wealth, but his hands fidgeted, betraying a nervous edge. He'd offered the restaurant after Lila saved his son, Leo, from the runaway stroller, a crumbling relic from his father's estate, unprofitable and forgotten. You don't have to stay here, he'd said in the park, his voice low. But it's a roof. A start. A start. That's what Lila needed. She and Sophie had nothing. No home. No savings. Just the black bag of scraps Clara had tossed them and the whisk from Evelyn's kitchen, tucked into her coat. The bailiffs had taken the apartment. Ethan's debts a noose she couldn't escape. Now this derelict space was her lifeline, its kitchen a faint promise beneath the ruin. She stepped inside, her sneakers crunching on broken glass. The air was stale, heavy with neglect, but she saw past it, past the dust to a counter lined with cakes, the walls alive with the hum of customers. She turned to Miles, her jaw set. Thank you. I'll make it work. He nodded, a flicker of smile breaking his stern face. I'll send a lawyer tomorrow. Papers to make it legal. Good luck, Lila. Then he was gone, his car's engine fading into the dusk. That night, Lila and Sophie slept on a mattress she dragged from a storage room, the springs creaking under their weight. She held Sophie close, the girl's small breath steady against her chest, and whispered, "We're gonna be okay, baby." The whisk lay beside her, a talisman of the dream she'd buried and unearthed again. The next morning, she started cleaning. She scrubbed the floors until her hands bled, patched chairs with duct tape, and hauled trash to the curb, her arms trembling but her resolve ironclad. Sophie toddled behind, stacking cups she found in a cupboard, her laughter a bright note in the gloom. With the last of their cash, $20 from a pawn necklace, Lila bought flour, sugar, and butter, enough for 10 cakes. Her first batch was simple, vanilla sponges with a swirl of cream, baked in a rusty oven that sputtered but held. She painted a sign, Lila's Sweets, on a plank of wood and nailed it above the door, then posted flyers around town, her handwriting shaky but bold. The next day, a woman in a floral dress knocked, hesitant. Saw your sign. Got anything ready? Lila handed her a cake, still warm, the cream glistening. The woman took a bite, her eyes widening. Heaven, she murmured, pressing cash into Lila's hand. I'll tell everyone. Word spread like wildfire. A trickle of customers became a stream. Locals, then travelers drawn by whispers of cakes that melted on the tongue. Lila baked through the nights, her hands flour-dusted, Sophie napping on a blanket by the counter. She hired help, a gruff cook named Tom, a shy waitress named Beth, expanding to pies and tarts, her recipes honed from years with Evelyn. 3 years later, the restaurant was unrecognizable. The walls glowed with fresh paint, a soft yellow that caught the morning light. Tables gleamed, chairs filled with chatter and clinking forks. A Michelin star hung above the door, earned after a critic disguised in a tweed coat declared her lemon chiffon a revelation. Lila, now 27, wore a crisp apron over a blue blouse, her hair in a neat bun, her hazel eyes bright with a fire she'd thought lost. Sophie, 6, darted between tables, her curls tied with a ribbon, handing out cookies to grinning regulars. She'd grown into a spark of joy, her questions endless. "Mommy, can I frost this one?" Her hands eager to learn. Lila watched her, a ache in her chest for Ethan, who'd never see this, but pride drowned it out. Then Miles returned. He stepped through the door one crisp autumn day, his coat swapped for a gray suit, his dark eyes widening at the bustling room. Sophie ran to him, shouting, "I remember you," and he laughed, ruffling her hair. "Lila," he said, approaching the counter where she piped roses onto a cake. I didn't expect this." She smirked, wiping her hands. "Neither did I. Guess I'm stubborn." "More than that," he said, his voice soft. "You're incredible." They talked, first about the restaurant, then about the years between. He'd been in the capital, running his empire, raising Leo alone after the boy's mother, Stella Reed, died of addiction. A story he'd kept buried until Lila's quiet strength pulled it free. She shared her own scars, Ethan's lies, the streets, the stroller that changed everything. Their meetings grew frequent. Dinners at her tables, walks in the park with Sophie and Leo trailing behind. Miles was steady, his wealth a quiet backdrop to a heart that matched her resilience. One night, under the restaurant's warm lights, he took her hand. "Move to the capital with me," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "I'll build you a new place, bigger yours. Sophie can go to the best schools." Lila hesitated, glancing at the sign she'd painted. "This is my heart," she said. "I can't leave it." "Then keep it," he replied, squeezing her hand. "Hire a manager. Visit whenever you want. But let me give you more." She thought of Sophie's future, of Ethan's broken promises, of Evelyn's dream reborn in this dusty shell. "Okay," she whispered, and he kissed her, slow, certain a vow of its own. Clara Evans, reformed and desperate, became the manager, her penance for that cold night years ago. Lila and Sophie moved to the capital, Miles opening a gleaming patisserie where her cakes drew lines around the block. Sophie, at 16, studied fashion in Italy, her sketches bold and wild, while Leo, 18, joined her there, his quiet charm a steady anchor. One spring day, they returned, Sophie in a flowing dress, Leo in a crisp shirt, stepping into the Capitol House where Lila and Miles waited. "Mom," Sophie said, taking Leo's hand, "meet my fiancée." "Dad," Leo added, grinning, "this is my girl." Lila and Miles froze, then laughed, the terrace erupting in chaos and joy. "Not siblings, huh?" Lila said, pulling them into a hug, flowers still on her hands from the cake she'd baked. A towering masterpiece for the occasion. The wedding was in their small town, the Michelin star restaurant packed with guests. Sophie walked the aisle in a gown she designed, Leo beaming beside her. Lila and Miles danced under strung lights. Her apron swapped for a soft blue dress, his suit rumpled from spinning her. As the music faded, Lila leaned into him, the scent of sugar and love in the air. "We made it," she whispered, her hazel eyes tracing the life she'd built from crumbs. "More than that," Miles murmured, kissing her forehead. "You made it sweet." Sophie and Leo left for Italy, their laughter echoing back, while Lila stood with Miles, her whisk in a frame on the wall, a relic of the girl who dreamed between the layers, now a woman who'd turned loss into a legacy of sweetness. Lila Brooks stood under the wedding lights, a glass of wine in hand, watching Sophie and Leo beam amid the crowd. From a girl smearing cake cream in a crumbling kitchen, she'd risen above loss, her mother's death, her husband's betrayal, a shattered home, to build a sweet empire with her bare hands. Miles held her from behind, his warmth a harbor after the storm. A Michelin star restaurant, a capital city bakery, and a new family, all sparked from a whisk and relentless grit. Life can crumble like dry cake, but don't give up. Every crack's a chance to need anew, with a pinch of sugar and love. Lila did it. You can too. Believe in your dream, no matter how small it seems.